All right, welcome back, everybody. This will be sort of part 3B. Um, I wanted to split this part up a little bit instead of moving on to a whole new step because this step 3 really is about basics of persuasion. If you watch the 3A video, we talked about the rhetorical triangle, the ethos, logos, pathos ideas. We talked a little bit about emotional appeals and balancing positive and negative appeals. Don't put all your eggs in one basket or the other. And so, what I want to continue with now is a discussion of fallacies. Before I do that, let me just make one quick announcement. I just left a faculty meeting and we were told apparently there is quite a bit of scholarship money remaining, more than normal for this time of year. And if you will be around Grand Valley taking classes, won't graduate until this time next year, next winter semester, you may be eligible for some scholarships that you may not know about. And so we have been told, as the faculty of School of Com, to advise you to check your My Scholarships link. Apparently, that's in your Student Hub information there. And it should tell you what you're eligible for, if anything, and give you some information that you can follow and see if you can get some money. All right. Let's keep going today again with these fallacies. What I want to do here is talk about not every fallacy out there. That would be a whole class, and you still couldn't get through everything. But I want to talk today about some specific fallacies. And before I do that, let me just start out with a definition for you. When you think of a fallacy, most people have heard of this, but sometimes it's tough to put their finger on an exact example. But a fallacy is a poor use of logic. It's a faulty use of logic. And what makes it so dangerous is that it is so common that we as a society often go along with this poor use of logic and we give it credit where it's not due. The simplest example I can give you, and I'll give you some others, is an appeal to misplaced authority. Now, we'll talk about that one specifically in a minute with celebrities and athletes, but in general, when people say, they say that people are upset about the way this thing is. They say that. Who are they, right? So as educated people, as college, soon to be graduates, always, 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 two things. Ask, if that's said to you, who are they? What were you talking about? What have you heard? Where did you hear it? Was it on the news? Do you remember what source this came from? The other thing, as an educated person who will be speaking to people, who will be using communication, always do that work for your audience when you can. Don't just come in with the they say. Give an actual example of who they are. Now, having said that, I screw this up sometimes as well. When I talk about anxiety, for example, I often say, they say that public speaking anxiety is on par in America with fear of snakes and spiders. And I know that to be true from various studies, but if I were pressed, I couldn't cite a specific study right now to you. And so that's an example of, if you're trying to be persuasive, be clear about where your information comes from. But that's not the only logical fallacy. In fact, there are well over, I believe, 200. We are going to focus on these. The reason that we'll focus on these specifically is because they're so common. They're common in advertising and relationships and politics, everywhere. We're just so bombarded by these things. That's why we often just go along with the notion that they're accurate or useful. In reality, they're not. Here's the list. I will let you read that. I will not read it to you, but we'll go through these one by one, and then at the end, we'll review this same list and do a quick summary. All right, here we go. Ad hominem fallacies. The Latin translation there, ad hominem, is to the person, to the man. So this is when you attack the person and not the idea that's being discussed. If this were a debate, for example, it would be going after the debater and not what he or she said. So the prime example here is name calling. And, we've got Donald Trump, who is the name caller in chief. I mean, he's actually not done as much this second time around so far. I'm not hopeful or trying to give credit where it's not due. But the first time, everybody had a nickname, right? Sleepy Joe Biden, Little Marco Rubio, these kind of names here. Pocahontas was, the derogatory name for Senator Elizabeth Warren. But before Trump came along, this was often seen as weak and desperate. I mean, this is some little kid playground bully stuff. But it has made a comeback because of Donald Trump, and a lot of folks feel like they can deflect through name calling now, and it's somehow effective. For some folks, it is. For some folks who are watching people interact, they're going to see that and be like, "Yeah, that's right. Tell them." Other folks are going to see it and they're going to say, "Wow, that's childish," and that's up to each individual. But it is a fallacy to go after the person and not the idea. It's sort of one of my professors once explained it in undergrad like this: you can't tell someone in a debate, "Hey, you're a dumbass," but you can say, the idea, the plan that you just gave sounded like a dumbass plan to me. Now, I wouldn't ever say that to anyone in a debate proper, but that is just a prime example of going after name calling the ideas, the plans, the policies versus the person who's talking about them. Number two, we've got causal fallacies. Causal fallacies happen when people say that A caused B to take place, but in reality, it may or may not have. It may have contributed to it, but can we say that it caused it? Causal relationships are very difficult to establish. Very difficult. That's why still in America, you can get sued if you publish something saying that, besides a medical journal, saying that smoking causes lung cancer. You can say it contributes to it, that it's a factor, huge risk factor, that it can lead to other respiratory illnesses. But to say cigarettes cause cancer, it's something that you'll get a lawsuit for from big tobacco. It's because there's not enough evidence to support that straight up claim, and folks are at risk of losing a lot of money if they let that go, so they won't. Another example of this that happened in my lifetime, probably when I was around where you are now, was 9/11, following 9/11, the invasion of Iraq. And at the time, if you asked people why we were going to invade Iraq, the reason from the presidency, George W., was that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and that we needed to get in there and get those out before they did anything with them. Of course, those were never found, and it was almost determined that fully that was just a lie and an excuse to get in there. That's less important. What's more important is when you ask the average person at my school or the average citizen at the time, "Hey, why are we going into Iraq?" Well, 9/11. Well, I thought 9/11 came from Afghanistan, from the Taliban, or not the Taliban, but from Osama bin Laden. Well, yeah, but they're not in Iraq. Well, sure they're not, but a terrorist anywhere is a terrorist everywhere. So we've got to get in there and just root everything out. And so that was that causal fallacy that you chose. So Americans largely don't like to send their sons and daughters off to die. And so when we put boots on the ground in places, Americans often go, wait, what are we doing over there again? Ever since Vietnam, that's been let's check this out pretty close. And they don't get behind war very easily. But if you give them lots of options as to why we're going, and they can pick the one that fits best for them, you fooled them basically. And you've helped them fool themselves. So that's a causal fallacy. Be on the lookout for these, and don't say causes. You can say as associated with, is correlated with, but cause is a different level of proof. All right, number three here, the slippery slope fallacy. You may have heard of this one. This is when you say that if you take a step that is sort of controversial, that you are opening up the door to a lot more problems and a lot of pain. And so the idea is, as you see in the little slippery slope fallacy danger sign, that if you take that first step, you'll slip and then just bang your head all the way down. And there's no good evidence of that. We've seen that now with legalizing marijuana. Before that happened in places like Michigan and other states, the argument that some folks made I mean, you can make good arguments as to why you shouldn't legalize marijuana and also good ones as to why you should. But folks would make this slippery slope fallacy argument and say things like, if we legalize marijuana, the next thing you know, we're going to have junkies on every corner with needles hanging out of their arms. Wait, well, how did we get to needles from marijuana? Those are two different levels of drug use, arguably. And so the idea there was, well, if one thing goes, anything will go. That was also a big argument prior to same sex marriage equality. You would have folks who would question those who advocated for same sex marriage rights and say, well, that's the first step. If we let two men or two women get married, what's next? Some man wanting to marry his Porsche and some woman wanting to marry her St. Bernard, and where will this end? And the answer was clear, but it ends with two unrelated consenting adults. But again, the slippery slope argument was this is setting us all up for suffering and failure. So be careful with that one as well. Don't skip steps. If you want to make the argument that a legalization of drugs, of marijuana, let's say, will lead to heroin overdoses, and you can logically walk us from one place to the other, go ahead and do that and don't skip any steps. But if you're going to rely on our imaginations to fill in the blanks, you're not being responsible. All right. Next up, we've got bandwagon fallacies. Oops, they're not the champs anymore. Sorry, Taylor. No, I'm kidding. I'm not a fan of either team, really. I don't like the Chiefs particularly because I've always been a Raiders fan. But anyway, the idea here, no matter what sport you like, if you like them or if you like actors or whatever the example, it's when people think that a person, a team, a movement, or an idea is popular, is right because it's popular. And those two things can go together, but they don't always, and often they do not. So, to have something be popular and right is a little bit dangerous because then you've got folks who aren't thinking about what they may be risking, right? They just know everybody's doing it and it feels good to me, so I'm just going to go full in with it. And that's when we sort of lose sight sometimes of what we're doing. So going back to this fallacy specifically, the bandwagon fallacy is when people see something that is popular, they jump on it, they want to be part of a movement. You see this with the MAGA crowd, and honestly, not on the same level. Prior to that, you saw it with Obama supporters. I remember back in 2008, I voted for Obama both times, and I really understood why. Because at the time, you have to remember, this is 2008, I was much younger, and I had grown up in a very conservative household. And so, I was still I wasn't just going to knee jerk to the left and vote for a Democrat at that time. And so I really thought about it, and who he was running against, John McCain. And then I decided I was going to vote for President Obama. Now, a lot of folks, especially people I knew, and I was a young professor at that time. It was, I was 21. I moved quick. But anyway, there were people who were just, Obama. I'm going to vote for Obama. Oh, really? What do you like about his policies? I mean, he's just the future, man. That's what it is. It's like, oh sure, okay. And when you're on that side, it's real easy to just say, works for me, we get the votes. Been there, done that. And now we see it, at least I do, from the other side, where it's sort of like, what are they thinking over there? And it's sort of tribalism. It's this desire to be liked, part of something bigger. And what it risks is groupthink. And when groupthink happens, mistakes happen. Prime example of this, the groupthink being an issue, is the Challenger disaster. If you're familiar with that, it's when the ship blew up as it was going into space in the late 80s. But the idea there was that there was a leader on the team who was in charge of safety. And this person, after this launch, if it was successful, was going to be promoted to a higher level position in NASA with a lot of power and ability to spend money. And the team, of course, he was going to take his team with him as he moved up. And so the team was really dead set on having a successful launch. And there were two engineers on the crew that weren't part of the group think. They didn't really care. I don't know what their stories were, but they said, "Hey, there's a leak in a ring, a seal, and if we launch at the time of day we're planning on launching, the condensation and the dew will do something, and we'll have a leak and an explosion. We got to fix it." And so they brought it up, and the rest of the team looked to the leader, and the leader said, "I don't think it's going to be a problem." So without much thinking, no, it's not going to be a problem, and we saw that it was. So groupthink is a always problematic situation when people stop thinking for themselves and they stop questioning. So if something's popular, it doesn't mean it's wrong, but make sure you understand why you're advocating for it. Don't ever advocate for something on the grounds that it's popular. Next up, we've got either or fallacies. This is when any issue is only looked at from polar views, like there's only two sides. Um, this is seen in a couple different ways. I like to talk about this, and I want you to, if you're listening and you're going faster than normal, slow down, listen to this part. This will help you everywhere. There's an idea of a continuum, and you see that visualized here on this slide. If you use the example of pro-life, pro-choice, and you think of pro-life in the blue and pro-choice in the red, or whatever side works for you. When we divide out an issue like women's reproductive rights into two camps, pro-life, pro-choice, we miss the middle, right? Most people would say, if you're pro-life, what does that really mean? Well, it means that I think abortion should never happen, ever. Any exceptions? If you're pro-life, absolutely not. No exceptions, no matter the situation, no abortion, it's illegal. If you're pro-choice, when should you be able to have an abortion? Anytime you want to, because that's your choice. It's your body. And until this fetus, baby, whatever the technical word you want to use in whatever policy is being written, until it's out and breathing on its own, it's part of me, and I can make that call. Most of us would say to both those people, "You're crazy. What the hell's wrong with you?" So, pro-life folks, what about exceptions if a woman's health is, in severe jeopardy? She will die if she has this baby. And the baby may or may not, make it. We don't know. Nope, can't do it. That's, to me, insane, right? Most people would agree, well, okay, if it's in that kind of a dire situation. What if it's an ectopic pregnancy, or if it's something else where the child is not going to make it anyway, and carrying the child to term to deliver it stillborn would be horrible risk for the woman. Yeah, okay, well, that doesn't count either because, we're making exceptions now. I like it. What about if it's rape or incest? What about if she is under a certain age? What about a disability that would maybe, not from the child, but I mean, if she gave birth, that she has an existing disability that would, cause her severe problems, whatever it might be. Most of us can get to a place toward the middle with some of these exceptions. You go to the other side. When is it okay to do this? Anytime you want. Well, God, no, right? We even people that are pro-choice, most of them want a time frame on it. And one of the ways that folks scare other people is to talk about post-birth abortions. Those are called murders. But those just aren't real except in extreme medical situations. And that's a whole nother technical term that I can't define. And we would need a medical expert to explain. But when you ask people, well, what are some exceptions? Well, okay, after the whatever trimester, after this point. Okay, well, what else? Well, that's about it for me, just on time. Hold on now. What if you have someone who is, being forced to have this baby, or sorry, that they were, trying to back it up. Lost my train of thought there. If you had someone who was very pro-choice, but then you had someone who this was their, 30-second abortion or whatever it might be, what about health in that aspect? If we do another abortion, we may hurt you more than if you go ahead and have this child. So we're not going to do it that way. Because then there's all kinds of liability issues that the hospital and the doctor would have to deal with. If, again, there's parental consent issues that people might want to deal with that some states make exceptions for. Right? So most of us are toward the middle when it comes to all of these issues. But to give an ultimatum of sorts and say you're either with us or against us is not doing anyone a service when it comes to persuasion or to being an informed citizen. Life exists on a continuum. This is the whole gender argument, right? Or we male or female. First of all, that's sex, not gender. Masculine and feminine, maybe, with androgynous in the middle would be gender, if you wanted to define it that way. But even then, most of us aren't all the way masculine or all the way feminine. I'm wearing a pink shirt. That automatically takes me over. It's fine. Who cares? But life exists as a continuum, not as a series of two choices over and over again. And if it does, you are missing a whole dimension of life. Next up, we've got straw fallacies. This is when you make the other side, the opposing argument, look so weak that you can just beat them up, and then it doesn't really give them the credence that they deserve. Their argument isn't represented fairly. So you knocking it down isn't effective because you've really just beat up a scarecrow, a straw man, if you will. So an example of this, to continue on with like the pro-life, pro-choice thing, people who are pro-life may look at the pro-choice side, if you want to generalize it that way, and say things like, well, those folks over there are just a bunch of baby killers, right? That's a common name. And that oversimplifies, misrepresents that whole position of being pro-choice. But it makes it easy to defeat because nobody likes a baby killer, right? I mean, we send those people to prison for the rest of their lives, or worse. But then on the other side, pro-life, you've got the folks on the pro-choice side that look over at the pro-life people and say things like, you know, all they want to do is control women, control everything about women's lives. And some of them, I'm sure, do, but not all of them. Many of them come from a very good, well-meaning place of trying to, recognize the sanctity of life. And that's respectable. And again, most of us are somewhere in that middle and not over on the poles. Next up here, a red herring fallacy. That is a fish. A red heron the heron is a bird, but a red herring is a fish. And this goes way back to like when we would put people in debt or put people in prison for being in debt, which makes no sense because then you can't earn money. But when people would often go to these places, they would have low security and people would break out a lot. And when that happened, they would try to escape. They're running away. They see that the guards see that there's a person missing or whatever, and they release the hounds, right? And so the hounds follow the smell. Well, this comes in because it references making a distraction, creating a distraction. And so the idea would be that convicts who were on the run would find one of these fish, which were plentiful apparently in England in medieval times, but they would grab these fish, rip them in half, and throw half in one direction, half in the other, and then go in the other, right? The third direction. The fourth is behind them. When the dogs would follow the scent to the river, the scent would fade, and what's that nasty rotting fish smell now? And the dogs would often want to go check it out. All this is creating a distraction, creating more space for them to run away. And so in debate or in speech making, if you introduce an irrelevant issue to shift focus from what's actually being discussed or talked about, you have used a red herring fallacy. Most common now is a whataboutism. This was again popularized by Donald Trump in the first election cycle when he won, when he was running against Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton would bring up over and over again that he had been accused 25 or 6 times, different women, of sexual assault. And his response was never, I didn't do that. I mean, he may have, I'm sure he did from time to time, but in the debates, it wasn't ever, I didn't do that. Those women are lying. I'm innocent. It was, what about Bill? What about Bill? Didn't he have an inappropriate affair in the White House? Didn't a woman accuse him once of sexual assault? What about Bill? And for his supporters, his fans, that was enough. It was like, oh, burn, got her. Hillary, I mean, didn't come back with, I don't see Bill. I see me. You want to talk about me? That's, I think, would have been helpful for her, but it was this what about this other thing, right? So this is anytime you may see this in an argument with a friend, you tell her, hey, you still owe me for the rent. You still owe me for the rent. Well, what about that time I drove you home and you got drunk? Was that a $300 ride? You still owe me for the rent, right? So A red herring fallacy is a distraction. Stay on point when you're making a persuasive argument so that the audience can stay on point with you. All right, last one here is that appeal to misplaced authority. This is when you could say they generally, but often it is when you treat a specific non expert as an expert and you put way too much faith in their opinion simply because you know who they are. Arguably, this is another Trump related fallacy with his whole rise to power. But we see it most often with celebrities in advertisements. So I've got Bieber here, but anybody would work. Proactive, the skincare line, did a whole row, just a bunch of commercials back in the like 2010s, maybe late O's. But there were all these different celebrities. I think Justin Bieber and Katy Perry were probably the two most well known. But they were talking about, oh, I use this because it keeps my skin clearer than anything else I've used, and it's amazing. That's all well and good, but how many books do you think Bieber has read on, well, you could stop there, but how many books do you think Bieber has read on facial astringents and how the chemicals can cleanse your skin and prevent breakouts but not be too harsh? And how do you, none. But they pay him, and so that's what he does. He may use it. He may have used it before they paid him to, but he definitely does once they pay him to. And that's interesting for me because there was a situation where a law had to be changed. There was a problem with celebrities back in the 60s and really the beginning of celebrities from the radio era all the way through the 60s into the 70s of celebrities endorsing products they didn't use. So the case in point was a football quarterback named Joe Namath. So this guy won the Heisman at Alabama, then played for the New York Jets. It's called Broadway Joe. He was known for being a sort of a wild, swinging guy. You know, he's living in New York City. He's always wearing a fur coat. He's always got 3 or 4 very attractive women with him at the time. And that was his persona. And so a reporter goes to his house to interview him about football. And he asks him if he can get a drink. And of course, he says, yeah, it's in the fridge. So this reporter goes over and notices that he has a really nice refrigerator. He also remembers that Joe Namath is doing radio commercials for an appliance store in New York City. And that appliance store is aimed at lower income folks. They don't sell the brand that Joe has. And so he was like, Joe, I thought you buy all your stuff from, Carl's appliance shop down there. And he was like, no, I just do commercials for them. I don't even buy that stuff. And so he included it in his story and it caught fire. So folks started asking these questions. Well, is that right? Can they do that? Long story short, there were some rule changes, some law changes. And now there is an expectation that a celebrity or anyone that's endorsing a product will have, quote, reasonable use of that product. And that doesn't mean that Joe couldn't have a nicer refrigerator. That just means he needs the garage fridge to be from Carl's appliance store, that he keeps his steaks and his beer in. And so that's sort of the way that people were able to get around that. Bieber doesn't have to only use Proactive, but boy, he needs to keep some on hand so that he's got it in case anybody asks questions and really, has some reason to dig. But this is a fun one too for me because I think it's the birth of a product you're all familiar with. Later in his career, after this rule changed, Joe Namath, his last season in the NFL, came out with an advertisement for Legs pantyhose. And it's him. He had done a Playgirl shoot where he's on this bearskin rug or something. And so he recreated that, but now he's wearing Legs pantyhose, and that was the commercial. And everybody thought it was kind of a laugh, but some folks were like, Joe, you're the reason that you can't do that anymore. You don't wear Legs pantyhose. And he was like, actually, I've worn them since high school. What? He's like, yeah, every time I play in a game, I wear them underneath my pants and my pads and all that. And it helps I feel better when I wear them. Now we call that Under Armour, right? So the person that invented Under Armour was inspired by that story. So anyway, just how an appeal to misplaced authority can come out pretty good, but it's not something you want to do in a speech or in any sort of presentation where you're trying to establish and maintain your credibility. So here we go. Here's the list one more time. The ad hominem is name calling. Causal fallacies, when you say this caused that to happen, but it's not clear. Slippery slope is when you say if you do one thing wrong, you're going to have, or different, you're going to have all these other bad things happen. Bandwagon fallacy is when you argue something is the thing to do simply because it's popular. Either or fallacies are when you give people two choices as if the whole middle doesn't exist. Straw fallacies, or a straw person, straw man fallacy, is when you set the other side up like it's a scarecrow, easy to defeat, and you don't give it its due diligence. Red herring fallacy is a distraction that has nothing to do with the argument at hand, and an appeal to misplaced authority could be a celebrity endorsement, or it could simply be saying that they say, and trying to really, make people change their behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, or values based on what they say. It's irresponsible to do. All right, we're going to talk next time a little bit about some delivery elements. We'll hit that harder. But for now, that wraps up the basic delivery stuff that I wanted to talk about. I'm sorry, basic persuasion stuff I wanted to talk about. But I will be back with more videos that continue on with the topics listed in the syllabus. So make sure to be on the lookout for those. Thanks for watching, and more to come.